Good morning, ladies, and nice to see you again. This is the final narrated PowerPoint on CC13, which is fiscal policy and supply side policies. And the first thing we're going to do is just take a quick look at microeconomic supply side policies and how some supply side policies can be used to influence micro. Individual firms and the microeconomy rather than macroeconomic principles that we talked about before. And then we'll compare the free market and interventionist view, and then we'll look at some conflicts between different macroeconomic objectives, which will be sort of revisionary to a point in that you will have covered some of this, but also it'll give you some practice to sort of compare and contrast different macroeconomic objectives, which hopefully will start to bring the whole of the macro bit together much more clearly for you. So that's the plan for today. Let's get cracking straight away. So fundamentally then, as I mentioned before, we can use, or the government can choose to use, supply side measures to microeconomic issues as well as macroeconomic policy, and we'll look at some of those together. Now there are some notes in the booklet for you to take a look at, and they are on page 47. So we're looking at page 47 in the CC13 booklet, but also there's significant notes in Powell, and I'll give you a reference for where those are in a moment. Okay, so things that can happen as far as micro economic supply side policies. There are industrial policy measures that the government can introduce. There are labour market measures, and there are financial and capital market measures. And each one of those, although you'll see that in some instances, particularly as far as some of the interventionist supply side policies we looked at, very much targeted at macroeconomic performance and improvement, some of those can also be applied to micro, as we'll see. So let's take a look at these and break these down in a bit more details. So, and obviously, as I mentioned before, page 47 in your booklet, and also Powell textbook 4th edition from 486 through to 488. There's some further details that you can add to your notes should you wish to. So things that can happen as far as the industrial policy measures are concerned. Certainly privatisation or marketisation can help. Deregulation of certain markets, again, will certainly help individual firms. Setting up of internal markets and the way in which those can actually assist certain firms, and also subsidisation of spending on research and development are things that, although they are clearly, or you could argue, are macroeconomic, certainly some of those measures can be used to successfully influence the way in which individual firms might behave. And so to some degree there is some potential microeconomic effects that each of those would have. And like I said, there are notes within Powell to describe each one of those in a bit more detail as far as micro is concerned. If we take a look at labour market measures then, and some of these again are fairly obvious, and in some ways looking at some of the interventionist policies that we've just described, each one of those will to some degree have an effect on individual firms too, and individuals and firms effectively, so microeconomic on a microeconomic scale. Clearly lower rates of income tax will have a significant effect on the amount of disposable income that individuals might have and their incentive to work. The reduction of state welfare benefits to average earnings, again, might actually influence the labour market and make it slightly easier for firms to employ people, or for more people to want to work, and obviously that can increase the overall level of human capital that's available. Changing employment law to reduce the power of trade unions. Well, we talked specifically about that in interventionist policies, and that's clearly going to make it slightly easier for businesses to employ people, and as a result, that's clearly going to influence the firm's policy. The repealing of legislation which limits the employer's freedom to employ. Clearly, if you repeal legislation, that means you reduce the amount of legislation, and that would make it easier for firms to employ people. So taking away certain law that might make it slightly more difficult and more expensive, and that clearly would have an effect. More flexible pension arrangements would also assist, as would the improvement in the training of labour. So each one of those, and like we've said before, some of those are seen as interventionist supply side policies that help macroeconomically, will also have some influences on microeconomic performance too. Take a look at the final one in the example, where we're looking at financial and capital market measures. Clearly, the deregulation of financial markets and encouragement to save. In some cases, if financial markets and capital markets it's made easier for people to borrow money, then that's clearly going to promote entrepreneurship and risk taking to a point. And also, one could argue that the financial markets and capital markets measures that could be included might actually reduce public spending and public sector borrowing, which again would have some effect on microeconomic policy and also individuals and firms. So, like I said, there's more detail in PAL that if you want to add some notes to your booklet in order to just make that clear in your own mind. Okay, so the next thing that we've sort of done it as we've gone along to a point, but I also want to look at this principle between the two types of supply side policies that we've described. One is obviously market based, so encouraging the free market to help in the supply side process, but also this interventionist view, which is where the government essentially is coming in and is attempting to, in some cases, reduce or eliminate market failure, but also it's where they feel that there is a need for the government to step in where maybe the private sector may not. So let's take a look at how we can compare these two. It's only one slide, but there's a number of points that we're going to take a look at. So the argument is that, in terms of the free market and free market economist view, is to try to promote market conditions by designing policies that will stimulate market forces to hopefully improve the allocation of resources. And three main ways. One is tax cuts to create incentives to seek profits and to work harder. And one could argue that if that were the case, if we reduce corporation tax, then clearly businesses are going to want to seek to make more profit and are likely to, they'll keep more profit, and as a result that will create an incentive. And clearly individuals, in terms of income tax, if income tax is cut, it means that for every pound that you earn, you are going to essentially keep more than if taxes were at a higher level, and that again creates an incentive. Privatisation is very much about unleashing market forces to take business out of the public sector and into the private sector. And obviously all the things we talked about, competition, bringing more choice, cheaper prices, and the need for business to be more efficient, clearly are designed to try to actually stimulate and use market forces, free market forces, to influence previously publicly owned industries to improve from an economic standpoint. And then finally, deregulation, designed to really encourage enterprise and also to increase competition. So very much the free market, about competition, private sector nature of being much more profit targeted, all designed to try to improve, in this instance, supply side. If we look at interventionist policies, then excuse me, and try and compare and contrast why and how interventionist policies might work, they can also be supply side. And in most instances, again, trying to evaluate or analyse this, we're trying to say that they are clearly supply side, but in most instances, for those to work effectively, They've got to be targeting improving the efficiency and economic performance of individual firms, industries and markets. And these include, again, the following. Okay, I'm just going to move my picture just up there slightly because I think it's going to foul some of the comments we're going to look at here. So things that they can include, first and foremost, government spending on education and training. Industrial and regional policy, again, targeting different parts of the country and also different industries in an attempt to try and improve their overall efficiency through supply side measures that the government are actually introducing. Clearly, spending money on infrastructure such as roads, transport, communications, all designed to try to make it easier for businesses to do business and also for individuals to be able to become mobile and find decent work in different parts of the world. Subsidising spending on research and development, again, in trying to encourage more research and development, more invention and innovation, and again, trying to encourage us to become much more focused on producing goods and services that are going to be wanted by individuals in the future, and so as a result of that, making our economy more attractive to foreign direct investment, but also in terms of the product base, the product decisions that we're making and the sorts of things that we're attempting to sell to UK-based purchasers, but also international, so that international trade and exports can be encouraged too. So in most instances, as we said, interventionist policies tend to be based on the view that government intervention in the economy is needed to correct market failure, and in some cases the short-termism view that some businesses who are very profit-driven will take, and particularly if they're limited and particularly publicly limited companies, where there is the issue of profits in order to generate share price and dividends, which in some cases might mean that short-term views are taken rather than a long-term view, and that clearly could in effect reduce both investment and growth. So that's really a summary of some of the things that we talked about in the previous presentation, and compares and contrasts market-based and interventionist-based supplies policies. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense for you. So let's take a look then at a number of questions. There's 3 multi-choice questions for you to consider, all based on supply-side policies. Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance to have a look at each one of those and have a go at answering it. So on page 48, you've got the questions. So the first question is, which one of the following is most likely to be regarded as the supply side cause of higher economic growth? So again, have a think about each one, have a go at answering them. Might need to take 10 minutes or so to have a look and answer each one, and then we'll come back and look at what the responses were. Okay, so let's take a look at the first question then. So of the 4 options that we've got here, which one is regarded as a supply side cause of higher economic growth? Well, in this instance, that would be lower tax rates on income, because in that instance, obviously, that would mean that we've got more spending, more disposable income, and that's clearly, one could argue that would then encourage higher economic growth. So lower taxes on income means that individuals keep more money that they earn, and obviously the view is that then can be used to spend on consumption, and that clearly as a major element of economic growth, and aggregate demand in particular, that would be the response as far as this one is concerned. Okay. Let's take a look at the second question. Remember, in this instance, what we're trying to remember is whether it's supply side or demand side. Now, we want this to be where you've been asked specifically about supply side policies. We've got to think about which ones are relevant to which area. Okay. So, second question then. One of the main functions of supply side policies in the UK is to And in this case, the response is to cause the rate of growth of aggregate supply to exceed the rate of growth of aggregate demand. Because if that can be done, then clearly that means that aggregate supply is keeping pace with aggregate demand, and we as a country are then fundamentally and as an economy are increasing our productive capacity, which then should mean that we can increase the size of our overall economy and with all the attendant benefits that brings. Okay, so that would be the answer as far as question 2 is concerned. And then if we take a look at question 3, which one of the following would be considered to be a supply side policy? So remember, if it's supply side policy, it's about trying to influence the supply side of the economy, and in this instance, clearly the cut in income tax rates is to boost incentives to work will essentially be a supply side policy. Okay, now in all of the other instances is about trying to stimulate aggregate demand, and clearly in that instance, that basically is a demand side rather than a supply side policy. Okay, so in this case, question 3 is the answer is B. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a test of your understanding based on what we've covered so far in CC13. But what we're also going to now take a look at is a little bit of revision, hopefully, but also just a couple of ways in which you might like to consider macroeconomic objectives and policies. And one of the issues is that effectively where we've got, and we've talked about this on numerous occasions, but this is really a summary and it gives you a chance to have a think about how you might be able to apply this in different situations, particularly if you're talking about, probably going to be more often than not a 25-mark question where, to be frank, in certain instances where we've got so many different macroeconomic objectives that the government is trying to achieve, then there is an argument to say that some of those, one thing that you might be doing to try and improve one macroeconomic objective might actually negatively affect another. Okay, and the argument is, as it states here, is it's likely to be quite difficult for an economy to achieve all of the objectives that we'll take a look at in a minute, especially in the long run. So we're going to just have a look at this in a little bit more detail and hopefully give you some ways of remembering in the heat of the exam room or in the heat of whatever the assessment process might be. Trying to remember, in this case, what the different types of macroeconomic objective are. So I'm going to give you some options to consider. Okay. The first one is icebergs, which some of you may have come across. It's a bit of a weird one as to what is an iceberg, but it's a good way of remembering different types of macroeconomic objective. Okay, so the different macroeconomic objectives that a government might set for itself are economic growth, low unemployment, low and stable inflation, equilibrium on the current account or of the balance of payments, achieving a balanced government budget, protecting the environment, and providing greater income equality. Okay, now obviously if you rearrange those, they're not in any particular order. One could argue I probably should have put them in an order that you could see actually spells icebergs, but basically if we take a look at income inequality and call that I, that is one of the first examples, and each one of these actually is a legitimate macroeconomic objectives. Okay, now icebergs is probably just the main way of remembering those key options. There are other alternatives, and you might find the next one slightly more attractive and slightly more visually appealing, but that clearly is a way of remembering the different macroeconomic objectives that the government is trying to achieve. And even just looking at those, you can see that in some instances, if we're talking about economic growth and the sorts of things that we might try to do to stimulate economic growth, well, encouraging more spending is to some degree then going to be an issue in terms of the level of inflation, because as we try to encourage more economic growth and spending, then there is a danger that that could actually create inflationary pressures. So let's take a look at the next one then. So that was macroeconomic objectives and icebergs as a way of trying to remember. In this instance, we're going to take a look at another option, much more appealing, certainly visually appealing than our icebergs, where we're talking about tigers. Okay, so it's just another means by which you can try and remember some of the things that the government is trying to achieve. Well, obviously, it's going to try and encourage trade, both national and international trade. It's got a target to try to manage inflation. Clearly, it's trying to encourage growth and levels of employment, redistribution of income, and also stability. So to be honest, they're a bit more general in terms of the overall macroeconomic targets, but they are just as relevant. Okay, and it depends on which one you prefer, and it's really just a means of trying to remember the different types of objective that the government is trying to achieve. I don't really mind which one you use to remember them as much as anything. It's giving you some choice so that you can actually consider that. I've also included a couple of very good resources in terms of both Tutor to You and Econs Plus Style, looking at both macro objectives and their conflicts. Some macroeconomic indicators for Econs Plus Style, and then again macroeconomic policy conflicts as far as Tutor to You is concerned. Those links are all working and will give you a good source of revision or research should you want any more information to help you. Okay. Again, I'm going to provide this PowerPoint to you on Teams so that you can take a look at some examples, and this is just an example of the Phillips curve. It's a 60-second economic YouTube video narrated by David Mitchell. You maybe have come across them before. So it's like a 60-second lesson in economics. In this instance, it's about the Phillips curve, and this is just where we're now starting to reference some of the things that I'd like you to consider over the next few slides. Okay, so that live link should work and should take you straight to the Phillips curve. But the relevance to that is down to the way in which we're going to take a look at helping you to sort of analyse and evaluate some of these issues in terms of macroeconomic policy options and how we might have some conflict as far as, in this case, unemployment and inflation are concerned. Okay, so in this instance, what I've tried to do is give you some structure and a way of sort of jotting down some of the views that you might have as far as this is concerned, but also as we've gone through it on about 3 or 4 of the macroeconomic objective issues and the conflict between them, we've also given you some thoughts as to how you might want to answer that as a response. Okay, so when we look at low employment and low inflation, we've obviously got that as our area of conflict. Then we've looked at analysis, which actually might help us to consider that, and this particularly is as far as the Phillips curve is concerned, explanations of that and how that might then influence things, and then the evaluation as to why low and falling unemployment might not lead to high inflation. Okay, so in this instance then, and these tables are provided in your booklet, so you can use these as a means to sort of test your understanding, and have a go at each one of these and see if you can, based on your knowledge and the level of understanding plus some of the revision sources that I've given you, just have a go at responding to that. Okay, so let's take a look at how we might want to answer that, and if this was one of the issues in terms of trying to get both of these policies, macroeconomic objectives, via the policies achieved. Okay, so if we looked at analysis, then the Phillips curve, as I'm sure some of you will know, or certainly based on the activities that you've done to find out a little bit more about it, basically suggests that low unemployment will lead to higher wages as shortages emerge in the labour market. As a result of that, we're going to have higher levels of aggregate demand, and that's going to rise to cause a rise in wage and price inflation if we assume the Keynesian AS curve. But if we have, and obviously in this instance, if we're talking about expansionary policies which are designed to stimulate growth and low unemployment, they could potentially conflict with a low inflation policy target. So if we're talking about expanding the economy, that clearly is going to be a little bit of an issue as far as the potential for encouraging inflationary pressures. However, one could argue that in this instance, particularly if we take a look at what the Phillips curve told us originally, but in actually, as we will have seen, the Phillips curve has actually been somewhat discredited in the light of certain things that have happened in the economy over the last few years. Well, in this instance, the argument is that in the long run, there is not necessarily a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. As in the long run, the argument is, or the argument could be, that if we're working at full capacity, our economy is working at full capacity, and in the long run, the view is that that will be the case. There is no unemployment, so the argument could be that the trade-off is only a short-run trade-off. So that gives you an idea of how you could actually, in this case, argue about the conflict and try to analyse and evaluate that particular example. Let's take a look at the next thing then, if we're talking about economic growth and the current account. So clearly, if we're thinking about analysis and then evaluation, the starting point could be that growth means rising incomes. Rising incomes means more imports, and that rising level of imports will mean a rise in the current account deficit, in that effectively more imports mean that effectively when we take into account our current account, the difference between imports and exports, if we've got imports rising, that clearly is going to be a little bit of an issue. However, we can always evaluate that and look at ways in which we might be able to balance the two. Okay, so in the second example then, let's take a look at how you might look at economic growth and the current account as the two policy objectives, also the two macroeconomic objectives, and how the policies might be used to try to address that. So if we take a look at analysis, as we've mentioned before, growth clearly means higher incomes. Rising incomes means more imports. Rising imports is going to mean a rise in the current account deficit. Okay, now if we're going to evaluate that, the effect is that if we've got imports that are far greater than exports, country might find it difficult to finance this balance of payments deficit. And as we've said before, we as a country, given the nature of the way in which we've moved from having a strong manufacturing base towards a more service and tertiary economy, and now moving into the knowledge economy, means that to some degree, if we're talking about the difference between imports and exports, that's always going to be an issue that we're going to struggle with in terms of balancing those balance and payments and deficits, particularly if we're talking about trading goods rather than trading goods and services. So if we're going to cut imports in this situation then, okay, so we've said that effectively our rising income, so economic growth is encouraging more people to spend money on imports. The argument would be in this scenario, if we were trying to sort of evaluate that argument, that if we cut imports by reducing domestic consumption and investment, that could potentially lead to higher unemployment, because if we had a fall in aggregate demand, that would also hit the demand for domestically produced goods. So again, it's trying to give this balance, this judgment, or a balance in your arguments, that which then allows you to give a real strong judgment paragraph at the end of any 25 mark or long question that you might get asked. Let's take a look at growth in the environment then, and again what we're just trying to do is give you some structure to think about. Okay, so economic growth is a good thing, one could argue, but it is potentially going to lead to resource depletion, and also growth might lead to forms of environmental degradation, and again you can argue that by taking a look at some of the research, thinking about how that might affect the environment in a negative way. Whilst growth is clearly a good thing because it's got lots of benefits, the argument is that it also has some fundamental impacts on the environment in terms of climate change and pollution, etc. So if we're looking at this analysis and evaluation for the third example then, okay, so we talked about growth may be leading to resource depletion because the more that we use up our finite resources which are being used to drive economic growth, the less options we've got. And clearly, again, if we think about this principle of growth being, it's all about growth, 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 and rapid growth, the argument is that that can lead to environmental degradation, because there might be a bit of a blind eye turn, less concern about environmental considerations, and clearly that could be a significant issue. However, one could argue, if we were going to evaluate that and sort of give some balance to that, you could argue that the economic growth rate, if it's high, means that we could potentially, governments through their tax collection, could choose to employ more resources to encourage better environmental policies designed to protect the environment and limit the impact of economic activity on the environment. Okay, that might encourage inefficient firms to become more effective, of course, and in that instance, you can see again you've got some balance to the argument for economic growth versus environmental damage, and then gives you a chance to then look at some judgment paragraphs based on a balanced view of all the arguments. Obviously, growth and low inflation is one of the big ones, and again, thinking about how we might be able to balance those two things. Growth clearly is going to be caused by or accompanied by a rise in aggregate demand, and the problem can be, if we've got rising aggregate demand, that can in certain situations cause a rise in the price level. And one of the nice things that you could do here is to show that graphically. Okay, so now as you can see, we've looked at 3 examples and given you some examples of how you might choose to analyze and evaluate, and what I'd like you to do is have a go at completing the rest of them, and it doesn't have to all be done in one go, but again, so that you've got a nice clear argument and some analysis and evaluation to argue about this. So growth and low inflation would be another clear conflict between 2 things. Growth and income inequality, then again, if we think about some of the principles of that, and we've given you some starters for 10 more rather than actually completing it for you. So growth is likely to involve the wages of some rising faster than the wages of others. So again, that's the starting point that you can analyze to some degree, but then obviously try to evaluate that too. A balanced budget and low unemployment. So in certain situations, clearly the government is trying to balance its budgets, but also it has a target of low unemployment. So in a recession, aggregate demand will be low. Maintaining a balanced budget will mean that to some degree, that if we have that scenario where we've got lower aggregate demand, then that's going to mean that unemployment will remain high, and that means that the government is going to have to spend more money on benefits and universal credit, where less people are working or choosing not to work or being economically inactive. Again, there's some evaluation points that you could add in there too. Income inequality and economic growth. Again, there is an argument to say that higher levels of economic growth will lead to hopefully most people benefiting, but there's clearly going to be greater income inequality, and that may require higher rates of income tax in order to try to balance this, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, for want of a better term. Okay, now clearly in some instances one could argue that if that happens, then that's going to create disincentive effects and reduce business activity. However, again, there's an argument to say that there are other things that could be at play, and that would be an evaluative process for you to take a look at. Okay, so those are just some examples, and it will give you a chance to have a look at some options as far as analysis and evaluation for different types of macroeconomic objectives and trying to achieve that. And then I've just created a summary here which looks at demand side policies and also some supply side policies. So if you like, we've looked at demand side, we looked at monetary and fiscal policy earlier on in the CC13 booklet, and we've recently looked at a range of different supply side options. And basically I've broken that down into, as you can see there, demand side, monetary and fiscal. So we looked at the instruments of monetary policy, so the bank rate, changing interest rates, and also quantitative easing affecting the money supply. And then we've also looked at fiscal policy, which again are all about trying to influence the demand side of the economy. So government spending, how the government chooses to spend its tax revenues, how it raises its tax revenues and the different forms of taxation that it might take, and also managing this principle of budget surpluses or budget deficits, depending on what it's trying to achieve. Then we've listed the different ranges of policies that are available on the supply side, and they range from increasing incentives to encouraging and promoting competition, reforming the labour market, improving the skills and quality of the labour force, and also improving overall infrastructure to try to encourage supply side economics. And there's a list of 12 different instruments that are included there. Some of them are clearly free market, some of them are interventionist, and that we've looked at how those things split based on the work that we've done previously on supply side, both free market and interventionist. So that's quite a nice summary and revision of policies that you could use in order to influence both the demand side of the economic equation and also the supply side. So taking a look at how you might again consider this, and this gives an example of how you might consider it. So looking at each policy, what the intended effect might be, and then other effects. So almost you've done a little bit of not so much analysis, but as far as the intended effect is concerned, but in general terms, what is the policy? What is that intended to? How do we think that policy might have the positive effect, but also considering some of the other effects? So we could consider that in both the short run and the long run. So if we take the first example, increased government spending on education, the intended effect is to improve supply side of the economy through improvements in human capital and productivity, leading to growth. But other effects that might have in the short run, and we can look at that from an individual standpoint, we could look at it from a government standpoint and from a firm standpoint, which actually might give us some interesting things to consider. Second example there of another policy, increasing the bank rate, which obviously is a monetary policy. That would so in that case, interest rates would be increased. That would be designed to try to reduce demand pull inflation. However, some of the other effects that it might have, it's going to mean there's higher cost of investment, and that might lead to less businesses investing, and that clearly could cause a stalemate in terms of trying to encourage further economic growth. Okay, so in each instance, there are some tables as shown above, and some exercises that I'm also likely to take a look at too. Okay, so let's move on to the next example then. Exercises then. So in this instance is page 54 in your booklet. The government attempts to reduce the rate of inflation by reducing aggregate demand, AD. With all other things being equal, ceteris paribus, in the short run, which of one of the following combinations, A, B, C, or D, is most likely to result in a reduction in AD? Now, it's very important when you get a question like this that, number one, you read it clearly, and also then look at the options that you've got to consider. So you've got to think about level of employment, economic growth, and balance of payments on the current account. Okay, so in this scenario, if we've got a situation of A, B, C, or D, we've got to consider all the things that have been asked in the question, plus also making sure that each one of those things is actually the desired, the effect that it will have. So in this instance, we're looking at government's attempt to reduce the rate of inflation. Okay, so things that it could do to reduce the rate of inflation by reducing aggregate demand. And in the short run, which one of these combinations is most likely to reduce aggregate demand? So give it some thought, have a go at answering the question, and then we'll come back and take a look at what the response should be or is. Okay, so in this instance, let's think about this. And if we're talking about reducing aggregate demand and trying to, in this case, reduce inflation. Okay, if we're reducing aggregate demand, there's a danger that in this instance that the level of unemployment would increase. The level of economic growth should decrease if we're actually attempting to reduce aggregate demand and trying to reduce inflation. And that should also mean that the balance of payments on the current account should improve in that situation. Okay. let's take a look at the next question then. Question 2. Choosing between faster economic growth and a satisfactory balance of payments best illustrates what? A possible conflict between competing objectives. Okay, so in that instance, that is the most suitable answer to the question. Okay, and so that's the process for that one. So that one actually should be C. The answer should be C. The third question: in the short run, a fall in a budget deficit is most likely to increase what? So a fall in the budget deficit, so that suggests that actually we're spending less on the government is spending less. In this situation, it's most likely to increase levels of unemployment. Okay, so if we're talking about a fall in the budget deficit, the government is choosing to spend less in terms of its government spending and the amount of taxation that it's raising. So that is most likely to cause an issue in the short run as far as unemployment is concerned. Let's take a look at the fourth question then. In this instance, the table below shows the unemployment rate and inflation rate for an economy between 2010 and 2012. Which of the following can be deduced from this data then? Okay, so looking at the data, we've got unemployment rates and inflation rates, and obviously in this instance we need to look at that information and then look at the different options as far as the responses are concerned. And in this case, it's actually the fact that throughout this period the value of money has fell throughout that time period. Okay, so you can see that essentially the inflation rate has gone up from 2010 to 11 and 12. So that's clearly a piece of information that you can glean from that. But there isn't a great deal. So if we're looking at employment rising between 2010 and 2012, well, it hasn't done, has it? It's fallen. Prices have fallen between 2011 and 2012. No, they haven't. Now, inflation has actually fallen slightly, but there is still an increase in inflation. And in the third question there was an inverse relationship between inflation and employment throughout the period. Well, that's not the case either. So there isn't that inverse relationship being demonstrated in the facts and figures that are shown here. And finally, the value of money has sort of clearly fallen throughout the period because we've had inflation at for each of those years. Okay, so let's take a look at the next couple of questions then. So if we take a look at the fifth question, expansionary monetary policy designed to increase aggregate demand is less likely to achieve this objective if at the same time the government chooses to do what? In this case, it would be to reduce the budget deficit. Well, clearly, if that were the case, if we're reducing the budget deficit, that is actually going to fly in the face of an expansionary monetary policy, because effectively one thing is designed to stimulate aggregate demand, and if we're reducing the budget deficit, then that is actually probably going to stop or reduce aggregate demand in itself, okay, rather than increase. Sixth question then, the government introduces a policy that initially increases the budget deficit, but in the long run increases the trend of economic growth. So this policy is likely to have been designed to increase by increasing subsidies for research and development of all of those four options. Okay, so clearly that is a long run thing, and in the long run, clearly, if we increase the subsidies for research and development, that hopefully is going to increase the level of research and development, and that in the long run should actually improve our international competitiveness, and that should then help to achieve some more balance as far as two things really. One, obviously increasing the trend of economic growth, because if that is happening, then if we've got better products and services being provided, that should actually help us to achieve that overall objective. Let's take a look at question number 7 then. and in this instance, we're looking at a conflict between macroeconomic policy objectives sometimes existing, but for what reason? So let's take a look at this as an example. And in this case, if we're talking about this conflict between the objectives that sometimes exist, in this instance, if we've got an increase in aggregate demand, that clearly could reduce unemployment, and also result in a deterioration in the balance of payments on the current account. Okay, so in some cases, that is a situation that needs to be considered. Okay, finally then, last question, explain why an expansionary fiscal policy could conflict with monetary policy. Now, these are typical example questions that you might get asked as far as comparing, in this case, different types of policy by both fiscal and monetary, and why those things might conflict. Now, explain why an contractionary fiscal policy could conflict with supply side policy. Again, so it's looking at, and you would need to be able to demonstrate you understand the difference between expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy, and also the effects that might have on different parts of the other policies that a government might choose to implement. And another example could be to explain how fiscal and monetary policy can work together to manage aggregate demand. So again, one of the things that we talked about is that in an ideal world, the government is probably going to need to use a mix of fiscal, monetary and supply side policies in order to manage the economy in the best way that it can, to provide stability, growth, and all the attendant benefits that those bring. So one of the things I'd like you to take a look at, and I've given you some fairly clear views as to how you might go about it, is to take a 25-mark question. In this case, we're talking about where we're considering the conflicts between macro and micro, and macroeconomic objectives. And in this case, the question is evaluate the extent to which demand side policies lead to conflicts between macroeconomic objectives. And that's pretty much what we've just been covering in this last presentation. Okay, so one of the things that you could do, and if you're thinking about this as a process, is to look at the 7 different conflicts that we've included in the course companion and select 3 that you think you're most likely to use in your answer. And if you can relate that in the UK, unless you know another country very well, that probably makes some sense in this instance. And plan your answer, maybe certainly using at least one diagram within that. We've talked about 25 markers and how they split. Normally speaking, we're talking about a split between 16 marks for knowledge, application and analysis, and up to 9 marks for evaluation. Econs Plus Star has got quite a nice example online that you can go and take a look at for how he believes that you can plan and write a 25-mark question in economics, particularly for AQA papers 1, 2 and 3, because you've got 25 markers in all 3 papers. And then the possible options that you could consider, and these are all from the course companion, is expansionary monetary policy as an example. Okay, then the fact that you've got issues around unemployment, low unemployment and low inflation. Again, you haven't got to include all of them. Include the ones that you feel most comfortable with in terms of explaining and having good evidence-based responses that you can use to support your answer. Okay, so examples of expansionary monetary policy there, contractionary fiscal policy that you could also consider, and each one of those we want to choose up to 3 of those. Okay, now the other thing that I'd like you to take a look at as well, I'm not sure whether you're going to be able to see this or not, hopefully you will, are the responses that have been attached at the end of this presentation, which actually help you to understand a wee bit more about how examiner friends might be assessing you if you were looking at this 25 marker. Okay, so we've broken it down in terms of knowledge marks, what things you would get credit for, how you might go about that. I'm not going to go through it all in a massive amount of detail. You can read and inwardly imbibe that. So it's breaking down knowledge marks into identification of, in this case, fiscal, being both demand side or an identification that fiscal policy is demand side policy, and then also looking at monetary policy as an option, and then also considering the different types of macroeconomic objective that we might include. Okay, clearly there is then the option of looking at AD and AS diagrams showing the shift in AD, and obviously making sure that you're narrating that within your answer is clearly a good option. And then also, when we're talking about how we can do that, looking at how we can consider the conflict, okay, and looking in this case at some detailed views on both fiscal and monetary policy, which are both considered to be demand side policies, as we know, and some of the issues around each one of them having some sort of conflict, particularly given the macroeconomic objectives that you're trying to explain. In addition to that, then looking at how you could then evaluate, there are some examples there of the typical types of evaluative statement that you could use and could consider, and that includes time lags and the elasticity of AS, the magnitude of the multiplier in terms of how that might affect things, and obviously in this case there's clearly going to be apparent conflicts that you can consider. And once you've effectively provided that view, then clearly one of the things, that balanced view in terms of whether you believe that there is to some degree some sort of demand side policies and the conflict that there may be between those macroeconomic objectives, coming up with a decent judgment paragraph to explain how you've arrived at that particular choice in your answer. Okay, so I know that was a little bit of a long one, but fundamentally that should cover you quite nicely for economic objectives, macroeconomic objectives, and how the conflicts occur, and also giving you some prep for how you might go about answering a 25 marker in the future. Okay, so hopefully that's been helpful. Obviously, you can always get in touch with me via the normal process. Obviously, we'll have an online catch-up later on in the week to discuss this too, but hopefully that's been helpful, and I'll speak to you soon.